Do it for 3 reasons.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right, so let's see, got it. I mean, there's 3 main reasons for testing your soil. 1, you're trying to optimize conditions for plant growth, right? 2, you don't want to waste your money by buying fertilizer or other amendments that you don't really need. And 3, as good stewards of the environment, we want to minimize any kind of negative environmental impacts. So at UConn, we're just a tiny 2-person lab. We don't have a lot of tests, but we do have a basic standard nutrient analysis. And with that, what it basically tests for is pH, and we do buffer pH to determine how much limestone and or sulfur would be needed. We were able to test for the macronutrients, including phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. We use modified Morgan, which is considered a weak acid. We also do extractable micronutrients and sulfur because we have gotten some reports from some farmers that they suspect some sulfur deficiencies in their soil. Mostly it's due to the Clean Air Act. We used to get sulfur from the smokestacks in the Midwest, and it's not coming this way, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but especially if you're growing, cold crops, or if you're growing onions, they do need a little bit more sulfur. We can estimate the cation exchange capacity, and for those that are interested, the base saturation. And we routinely run lead because most of our clientele is homeowners, and about 20% of the samples we get in do contain elevated lead levels. And then if for extra tests, which aren't included with our basic tests, we can do organic matter, soluble salts, texture, and we run PSNTs, pre-soil sidrous nitrate test in the summertime. So that's about our limit for soil testing. I just wanted to make it a point that with our lab, we're not testing the total amount of nutrients in the soil. We're testing what's extractable, i.e. what's available to plant growth. And your ideal situation is you would like your nutrients to be in the optimum, whether you're supplying them with, compost or organic fertilizers or chemical fertilizers. And then we'll tell you what the pH is, the CEC, you'd like it to be 10 or above. If you ask for a % organic matter test, we include that. We test micronutrients. There's only recommendations for boron actually in this state because boron's usually deficient in our soils. There is not field studies that we can make recommendations. We tell people to use these as a diagnostic tool. If the lead is elevated, we'll tell you what it is and we'll send you interpretation sheets about it. And then for farmers, let's say you're growing vegetables or even if you're growing small fruits, we make recommendations in terms of pounds of limestone per acre and pounds of NP and K per acre. And then for vegetables, there is Dr. Shiris Gamir, who is the extension vegetable specialist, and we send a copy of all of the commercial vegetables results to him. So sometimes soil testing isn't always enough because just because there's nutrients in the soil doesn't mean that a plant is able to take them up. Oftentimes, environmental factors and as well as your cultural practices affect what nutrients plants can take up. So we do offer plant tissue analysis, and this is to basically identify, nutrient deficiencies or imbalances. While we can do that with annual crops, oftentimes tissue testing is not quick. We tell people it takes about 2 weeks. And if you're an annual grower, it might not be quick enough for you to remedy the situation you're seeing, but it's particularly useful if you're growing perennial crops, mostly fruiting type crops. And sometimes it correlates really well with the soil test and sometimes it doesn't. So those are what we offer. I wish and I don't wish we could offer compost testing. Compost testing involves at least all of these tests. All of these tests are different. They all require a different way to prepare your sample, a different piece of equipment, different expertise. And we just do not, we're a tiny 2-person lab with some part-time help. We don't have the ability to test for all these things. And so it's better that you would send your compost to another lab. And some places that do test compost, the U.S. Composting Council has a list of the certified labs, and then includes Penn State, Woods End Lab, I think, tests compost, and University of Maine. For Yukon, we can tell you, do a quick pH and soluble salts and organic matter, which can kind of indicate if it's finished or not. But that's about all we can offer. You know, so we're a tiny lab, we can only offer so much. But these other laboratories offer a more complete compost testing. And the reason why it is expensive is because it tests for all of those variables. It doesn't just test for a handful, and you can't do it all on one machine. And then I just briefly wanted to mention the Master Composter program, which Greg and I started in 2019. It's a train the trainer program. You know, our goal is to give people, it's on a backyard composting level or community garden composting level. We don't have as many trainings, which is good that you're having one today, for a little bit higher municipal, you know, whether it's on farm or whether it's in a larger community garden. But the Master Composter program, we basically train 24 individuals a year about a variety of ways to compost recipes, the science behind composting. And the whole goal of it is by providing these volunteers with, and there is a small fee, there's a $100 fee for the program. We use that to cover the cost of our speakers and sometimes their travel. Then we expect in return that the people taking this class will learn about compost, and that they're going to go on and they're going to teach other people, and they can do it in all sorts of various ways. So the class itself will consist of some educational presentations. We're hoping we do some one or two field trips. In the past, we've had Worm Day, and this year we were thinking about doing it this spring, and then COVID all broke out again. So we're planning on maybe doing it in the summer or the early fall. If people are interested in the Master Composter program, they can send me an email, and I will put them on the list of people to be notified for that program. So I just want to say thank you for letting me share just a little bit about what the soil testing lab does and why we can't test compost. I wish we could. And I'm sure you're going to have a great presentation today on farm composting. So thanks a lot. So I will stop my
Thank
share.
you. Thank you, Dawn, for that. Can you just address one other workaround that you mentioned to me, and was about if you have compost that you could spread it and integrate it, and how long you would have to wait to then test it in a regular traditional soil test?
Yeah, so people, I should have mentioned this, but I forgot. So we can't test compost. I mean, if you send in a compost sample and we run it, what's gonna happen is all the nutrients are gonna be all above our highest standard. So we're not really sure exactly what they're gonna be. However, if you're using compost in a moderate manner, so you're adding maybe a half an inch, 2 inches of compost, and you mix it into your soil, if you wait about a month, you could send in a soil sample at that time. And as long as the organic matter is below 20%, because that's the cutoff. So our soil test is meant for mineral soils. Mineral soils are those that have 20% or less organic matter. We can test the soil, tell you what the pH is, what the nutrients are, if you have to add any nutrients, what they would be. And we can also do a % organic matter and soluble salt at the same time. So we can do that. And that's sort of a workaround for people that don't want to spend $100 on a compost test.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, Dawn. That's really, really helpful, because that's, you know, I think a great way of doing it, and doing a traditional test and getting some information back. So yeah. Thank you for sharing. And we'll definitely send some more people your way at the lab.
Sounds good.
All right. So what I'd like to do is just touch on a couple of logistics for the rest of the evening. And just a reminder to those of you who have just joined us that we would really appreciate if we could stay muted. Any questions that you have during the presentation, if you could put them in the chat. We will have time at the end for question and answer time, and Becca is going to feed both Yoko and Alex the questions. So don't worry, we'll get your questions answered near the end. And also, I know Becca dropped the very important evaluation for tonight's presentation in the chat. So if you want to grab that later on in the presentation and fill that out, I just can't stress enough how much that the evaluations are a really valuable tool for us. And we do really appreciate when you take the time to let us know how you enjoyed the program. It really gauges our success and helps us plan for the future. So without further ado, I would really like to introduce our presenters for tonight, Yoko Takamura and Alex Carpenter from Assawaga Farm in Putnam, Connecticut.
Hello, let me just share our screen really quickly. Oh, wait, what happened? Oh, can everyone see this? There's some kind of error
Jess is in this meeting.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Should be how come you can?
Ooh, I thought Zoom stopped for a second. All right. Okay, we've never presented just on compost, so I don't know how long this is going to take. So we're going to jump right in. And right, I'm obviously Yoko.
I'm Alex.
And this is what we're going to talk about today, just the flow of our slides. We'll start with the context. So we'll tell you how big our farm is, how much help we have, what we used to do in terms of applying compost in our fields, and what we kind of envision for the future. And then we'll jump right into compost making, starting off with materials that you'll need, ingredients to go into the pile. We'll do step-by-step process. And finally, the application of that compost in the field. And then we'll have a few slides to talk about teas and extracts. That's just a way to really get a small amount of compost applied to a really large area. So there's a lot of benefits to that. And I just wanted to mention here that, you know, we're not experts at composting. It's just we love to share what we've learned through composting. And obviously, I think most people have, you know, a little bit of experience with composting, whether it be static piles or, you know, actually making thermophilic piles. But it is a really complex process, and, you know, there's no one right way to do it. There's so many different ways, and this is just one way to do it. And so, you know, we may not be able to answer every one of your questions or have answers for your questions, but we'll try our best. And I'd like to also mention that much of the information today is what we learned from the Soil Food Web course. And what I really liked about the course was that it really kind of gives you a really clear way to start composting and kind of playing around with it. So, you know, I've been to many composting workshops where they tell you you can add this and that, and it's just, you're kind of left more confused than you were at the very beginning. And so what I liked about the course was that they give you precise kind of instructions to get your first pile started. And that's what we hope that you'll do from learning and listening to this workshop. And then from there on, it's just a whole bunch of like tweaking and playing around with different materials and just experimenting. So, you know, hopefully you'll take away some basic stuff today, and that's like going to be your building blocks to try to, you know, make some compost. And I think that's about it.
I think you got it all.
Some disclaimers. Okay, so here's kind of a quick overview of our farm. So we're in Putnam, which is the northeastern corner of Connecticut. We're really grateful to be working on Nipmuc land. We grow a diverse range of organic vegetables with an emphasis on Japanese varieties and vegetables. We're entering our 5th season. We have exactly 100 100-foot beds to give you an idea of how big our farm is. We have one greenhouse, which you'll see in the picture. It's part prop space, part growing space. We have 2 employees this season, and we go to one Thursday market, a farmer's market, and we have a farm stand on site on Sundays, May through November. And if we have any excess veggies, we do have some wholesale outlets for that. and we don't grow during the winter, and we've been no-till from the beginning. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with no-till farming. I would say a vast majority of no-till farmers employ this, what's called the deep compost mulch method. And that's what we were doing for the first couple of years on our farm too. This is where you apply a thick layer of commercial compost, either in the spring or fall, usually once a year. And along the way, a few years back, we kind of started questioning kind of the sustainability of that practice. There's the physical aspect of it, obviously, which is putting down all this heavy compost on every bed. But there's also this question of, do we want all this, this large amount of inputs from, off the farm where, who knows what's in it, where it came from. So there are possibilities of contaminants. And then there's also, if you're putting on that much of something in your soil, it's going to make it much harder to manage your nutrient levels. And so, or even know like what you're putting down and how it's affecting your native soil. So one thing that you could overdo with compost, and we see this with a lot of no-till farms, is that your phosphorus levels go up. And our soils kind of had high phosphorus to start with, but it definitely did increase our levels too. And high phosphorus inhibits mycorrhizal fungi. So that's a huge reason to kind of be aware of what you're doing. I don't think there's been tangible effects of having too much phosphorus in the soil. But it's something that we're at least a bit concerned about. So for all these reasons, we started looking for ways to make our own compost, and that kind of aligns with some of the goals that we had starting our farm, which is kind of to make some of our own fertility on the farm and to try to have a closed loop and try to recycle as much material on farm as possible. So that means avoiding large outside inputs. That in turn means avoiding some contaminants that might come with it, and then minimizing organic fertilizer in general.
So some benefits of doing our own farm-made compost. Like most things in life, diversity is a beautiful thing. By making it ourselves, we can ensure that we have high biological diversity in the compost and good diversity of inputs. When you're buying stuff from off the farm, you don't know what the inputs are, you don't know how it's composted. Knowing all the inputs allows us to avoid having contaminants. Whether those contaminants are chemicals, it could be persistent herbicides, pesticides. You could be using manure where the animals are getting antibiotics or dewormers. All of that is going to have a detrimental effect on your microbiology. You're also potentially bringing in weed seeds. We've brought in weed seeds that we wish we didn't have. We can monitor the quality much more so than an off-farm input. We'll talk a lot about that later. When we talk about quality compost, we're really focusing on the biological quality, the diversity in the biology. The purpose for us, like Yoko was saying, we're not putting down a ton of compost anymore. We have relatively high organic matter, and we had high organic matter to start, but we have been increasing it even though we've been cutting out the bulk compost. We do that because we're no-till, we use cover crops, we use mulching, things like that. So now that we're on that track, it allows us to really focus on the biological aspect of the compost being an inoculate. Another thing that you can do is really fine tune the compost. So if you do till, you probably don't have much fungi. Fungi tends to grow slowly and it doesn't like disturbance. It doesn't do well. Bacteria loves disturbance. So if you do till and you have a lot of bacteria in your soil, you can kind of compensate for that and make a more fungal rich compost. So you can kind of balance it. You really want that ratio to be close to 1-to-1, which is tough, but because we're not tilling, we have a lot of fungal growth in our soil. So we're happy with that. There's a lot more benefits that we'll talk about as well. Next one. So we do a couple of different types of composting on the farm. Some of it is intensive, we're really monitoring it. Some of it is more passive. The intensive composting that we do are thermophilic piles. So these are piles that are heating up. Something that's really nice about these is the turnaround time on them can be very, very quick, and as little as 3 weeks. That's going to be determined by environmental factors and inputs and things like that. But we have had piles be ready in 21 to 24 days, and that's pretty incredible. Last season we made, was it 16 piles throughout the season?
I think it was
14 piles. So we did a pile a week, and we felt really good about that because, like Yoko said, we were closing a loop. Most of the inputs were coming right from our fields, and they were being used fresh, turning right into fertility for the farm. So the intensive composting, really fun to do. We're going to talk about that a lot in this presentation. The less intensive composting, we have a big vermicomposting system that we're getting into. Worms are incredible. They eat organic matter and microbes. They kind of purify it, get rid of pathogens, and they poop out just gold for your garden. So vermicomposting is really easy to do. You can start super small. You can feed all your household scraps into it. Worms are awesome. And then something that we're going to really focus on this year, we've had kind of a static pile in the past. A static pile, it's where we just throw all the bulk stuff, but we don't really manage it. So this year we're really going to try to manage that more. It'll still be static, but we'll be adding more carbon into it, keeping it from rotting, getting some biological activity. And then if that sits for long enough, you can use it as you would compost, or we'll talk about how you can actually use that as an ingredient for the thermophilic piles too. So just a quick overview of our composting station. It's funny, earlier in the season last year, we were thinking about building like a shed type area with all these bays. It would have been really complicated, but we're kind of happy that we didn't do that. It's super simple. There's a picture of it in the upper right there. It's right against our wood line, very accessible from everywhere on the farm. So we basically got some pallets. We just scavenged them for free. We lay those down, we staple wire netting onto them so that you have a place so that the material doesn't fall through readily. And you can use what you have. We had poultry netting. It's like hexagonal 1-inch openings. That's worked great for us. Ideally, probably the smaller the opening, the better, because you're losing less material through it. So hardware cloth is great, but it's kind of expensive. So you can really use what you have. But the stuff falling through, it's not a big deal, because when we flip it, we scoop that up, it gets tossed into the pile, it doesn't get wasted. To make the cages that you see that hold the contents, we use fencing. We had some welded wire laying around. It has 2-inch by 4-inch openings. Totally acceptable. A little bit of stuff falls out the side, but again, we just scoop it up and throw it back in. If you have hardware cloth, great, you'll lose less stuff out the side. A couple bungee cords just to hold those cages together. We'll talk about how we're constantly removing and reshaping those cages, so it's good to not have them be fixed together. You want to cover them so that you're maintaining the moisture, and not, whenever there's a rain event, it's not getting soggy and anaerobic. So tarps to put on top, a couple of bungee cords to hold them down. We use manure forks to flip everything, to load it in. Those are great because they have long handles, makes it easier on your back, easier to toss in. A watering can to get the moisture correct. We'll talk about that later. Thermometer, we have two. We have a 2-foot and a 4-foot. The piles that we're making when they start are about 4-foot diameter. So you need at least a 2-foot rod to be able to penetrate and get right into the center of that pile, which is where you want to be monitoring the temperature. We use 5-gallon buckets. We use a lot of them. That's to measure out the components to each pile, and we'll go into that in depth. And then it's optional, but we just laid down a piece of landscape fabric that we had underneath it. Keeps it clean. When we go to flip the pile, we can just lift up that pallet and scoop up anything that's fallen off using a dustpan. So this system has worked out really well for us, and we're excited to keep going with it next year. Okay,
so I'll explain the ingredients, possible list of ingredients that can go into your pile. One thing I want you to remember is diversity is key. So whether it be, veggie scraps or wood chips, you really want, you don't want just oak wood chips, or you don't want just brassicas as your veggie scraps. You want to put in as many different types of ingredients as possible. So let me go through each category. So there's 3 main categories. So there's the high nitrogen sources, which can be manure, blood meal, grass clippings, and that's not an exhaustive list, but just a few things to get you started. So we use chicken manure. I want to give a shout out to Botto Farm. I'm not sure if Nick is on the call, but we use their precious chicken manure, which has worked out really well for us. You just want to make sure that whatever manure you're getting isn't, doesn't have any antibiotics or dewormers. So something like horse manure, I know that might potentially have those things in it. So it is good to have a good relationship with the supplier. Make sure you know what all the inputs are. Blood meal is something that we haven't used before, and we'd rather not use it, but it is good to have on hand just in case you need to bring up the temperature just a tiny bit, just to get you to that level to do the heat treatment. And then grass clippings. We use the clover that's growing in our living pathways, but if you're mowing some ground in a pretty frequent manner, you can collect those grass clippings and use that as your high nitrogen source. For greens, obviously, I think a lot of us here are farmers or gardeners, so veggie scraps are perfect. We also try to forage greens from surrounding areas. So much of the perennial, shrubs or herbaceous plants around would be great because, every leaf surface of a different species have different set of microbes. So you're really increasing the diversity there. And I mentioned to use immediately or store dried. So if you're using it immediately, that's the best way to use fresh greens. And if you're not using those greens in the next few days, then you kind of have to start thinking about drying them, because if you don't do that, then you're going to create some anaerobic environments where, the greens will start rotting, and those are the kinds of microbes that you don't want in your pile. So what we've done in the past before is to spread out the material, the greens material, in a thin layer into our black crates or bulb crates, and just stack them inside the greenhouse and have a fan running on it. So that works as well, but it does take up quite a bit of space and labor. Finally, browns. These include but are not limited to leaves, wood chips, chipped branches, woody plant scraps. And I want to mention, with leaves and wood chips, you want to have more than one type of tree species in there. So I think a common misconception is that you can only use hardwood in compost piles. It's not true. You can use softwood. Just make sure that it's aged. And same goes with pine needles. They can be used too. But it's best if it isn't fresh. But yeah, there's no concerns of it changing the pH or anything like that. So, the better, the more diversity, the better. And then something like plant scraps. None of these items are, black and white. So nothing is like purely green, nothing is purely brown. Everything's kind of on this spectrum. So, something like a broccoli plant, it might start off, if you chop it down while it's still young, it's going to be pretty nitrogenous. But if you're cutting it down at the end of the season, the stem's all woody, that's going to be more carbonaceous. So there's no, rules around or exact precise measurements of C to N ratio. There's some stuff online you can look at, like a list of C to N ratio, but I don't think that's very useful because things are just changing all the time. The C to N ratio is always kind of tending towards, a higher C to N ratio. So you really just have to try out different local materials that you have and make your own recipe and see what works, see what brings you up to that temperature that you need. So there's no, recipe that's going to work in every situation. And then finally, I wanted to mention failed compost piles because that's happened to us before, where the temperature doesn't come up enough to kill off all the weed seeds and the pathogens. So then we'll just use that as a browns material in the next compost pile that we make. So you can recycle.
Still you.
So the ratio of the three categories depends on the season. So, there's less high nitrogen that you need in warmer weather. But basically during the season, our basic recipe and what you can start off with is 10% high nitrogen, 30% greens, and 60% browns. So if you're making a 30 bucket pile, then you'd have 3 buckets of high nitrogen, 9 buckets of greens, 18 buckets, of browns. And so the breakdown is pretty simple. So chicken manure, this is our recipe, kind of what we started off with. And obviously we kind of change it around. They're not always exactly the same. So the chicken manure that I mentioned before from Bottle Farm is our high nitrogen. Sometimes somebody mentioned in the comments, the chat, about vegan piles or plant-based piles. And we've made those before, a number of them. And what we did for the high nitrogen was to use the clover from our living pathway, which there was a picture of it a few slides back where Alex is pushing a push mower. And it's really easy to collect a bunch of clover clippings that way. And that worked out really well. You just have to make sure to shuffle all the clover, because if there's any clumps, it's just going to melt into an anaerobic environment. So greens, we have obviously veggie scraps, as diverse as possible. And then browns, we use a mixture of new and aged wood chips. So with new wood chips, obviously you don't want that to be 100% of your browns, because it's going to take forever to decompose. New wood chips have one of the highest carbon to nitrogen ratios. So, and the benefit of an aged wood chip is that the wood chips already had time to develop some mycelium, and different fungi have already started living in it. So that will inoculate the pile much better. We do use leaves if they're around, and then we sometimes use hay as well.
All right, so this is how we build a pile, which we do weekly. So it starts the day before. Like Yoko said, we'll do it in 5-gallon buckets, and doing that makes it really easy with that ratio. We'll break it into 10-bucket segments. So if you're doing a 30-bucket pile or a 40-bucket pile, you're just repeating these 10-bucket sets. So the day before, we'll soak the ones that need to be soaked. And what I mean by that is fresh veggie scraps that are coming out have a very high water content, and they're not really going to suck up any more water. So we probably won't soak those, but new wood chips we will, hay we will, things like that. So we want to make sure that we're imparting an initial moisture level into everything, and we'll talk about why that's important. So then the day of that we're going to do it, the next day, we'll put a lid loosely fitted on the top, and we'll drain out all the excess water. We'll put a tarp down, and it'll usually be 3 of us working on it. So 2 people with manure forks and 1 person who's in charge of dumping the ingredients down. And we like to do that in a really thoughtful manner because it makes mixing it easier. So we might put down a layer of hay first, and then some wood chips on top of that, some veggie scraps, maybe half of the bucket of the manure, and we'll be mixing this the whole time so that we're really getting a nice mixed up pile going. And we'll do that for 10 buckets, and then we'll start to load that 10 bucket pile into the cage. And at that point, we'll move on to the next 10 bucket and repeat that. So we'll repeat that 3 or 4 times depending on how big the pile is. One thing that's really important, Yoko mentioned about clover clumping up and creating an anaerobic mat. Lots of things can do that. So you want to make sure that you're destroying any clumps. Manure that happens when it's wet, it'll really clump up. And if you don't break those clumps up, it's just gonna be a perfect little place for anaerobic, AKA bad guys, to persist. And you really don't want that. We're really going for aerobic organisms. Those are typically the good guys. Checking the moisture, it's really important to get the moisture level right. Don't add too much. You can always add more to the top of the pile once it's all built, but we like to try to get a pretty constant moisture going. And it's not an exact science. We just do a squeeze test. So we'll pick up a bunch, we'll squeeze it in our hands as hard as we can. And if a few drops appear between your fingers, that's good. That's maybe a 30 to 40%. And that's what we're looking for. If you squeeze it and a ton of water runs out, it's way too wet and it's going to lead to anaerobic conditions. So once we've mixed everything up, we throw it all in the cage, and then we'll take an oak stake or whatever we have that's about a foot higher than our 4 foot tall cages. We'll plunge it down into the center until it hits the pallet, and then that'll create a peak on the tarp. So whenever it rains, it'll just run off and it won't wet the pile anymore. So we're gonna show a quick little video of just us mixing. Hopefully it runs smoothly.
Do they? Yeah. Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
All right, so that was just a quick little look of how we put the tarp down in front of the pile. We've already put the 10 buckets on there. We probably have about 20 buckets in the cage already, and we're just mixing up the last ones there. But how do we get to the next slide? There we go. All right, so talking about turning them, which we do twice for every single pile. Like we said, these thermophilic piles, we really monitor them. And so right after we build them, we put a temperature probe right into the center of it, and then we're gonna start checking that. Depending on the time of year, depending on the inputs, it's gonna take a little while for it to come up, or in the middle of the summer when it's hot out, it might come up the next morning. It might be 150 degrees. But really, you wanna catch it when it hits 130, and that's when you wanna start the countdown. Above 130 is when it's going to be killing pathogens and making weed seeds inviable. So once it hits 130, if it stays between 130 and 150, you're gonna wanna cook it for 3 days before you turn it. If it goes 150 to 160, you can take that time down to 48 hours. And if it gets 160 to 170, 1 day will be enough to kill those things. If it goes above 175, you're getting into a little bit of a danger zone. It's good to punch chimneys into it if you're getting too hot. 180 is about the ignition point, so you really don't want to get there. But what you can do is we had a piece of metal pipe that we would just stick in and kind of work around and create little chimneys, get more oxygen into that pile and make it easier for the heat to escape. And when you do that, the amount of steam that comes out of it and the heat is incredible. So you really need to be monitoring this. And we keep a log just on Google Sheets, and we'll go over several times throughout the day, check the time, check the temperature, make notes, and really try to nail this timing. Because if you let it go, if you let it cook for too long, you risk it going anaerobic, and you can ruin the pile, or just set yourself up for failure. So it's really good to just keep an eye on it as much as possible. Once it's cooked for the correct amount of time, we got a little rough graphic on the right here showing how we break the pile into 3 parts. So it's gonna have that hot center where all the biological activity is going, and it's getting 150, 160 degrees. You're gonna have the top, you're gonna have the bottom. So what we'll do is we'll take 3 tarps and we'll put them around the pile. We'll take the top off, roughly. You know, you can kind of check with the back of your hand as you go down to find where the really hot spots are. And we're trying to take that off. And then we'll scoop the hot center out. We'll put that on another tarp. And then finally, we'll take the bottom off and we'll put that on the 3rd tarp. Then we'll pick up the pallet, sweep everything up, get everything into piles. And then when we rebuild it, the idea is that you want every part of that pile in 2 turns to go into that hot center and cook. That way you're treating for pathogens, you're treating for weed seeds, everything else. So when we put it back in, that hot center that we took out becomes the new bottom, the top that we took off becomes the new hot center, and the bottom becomes the top. So doing that twice, everything's been in the center. And again, throughout this process, you're checking the moisture level, you're squeezing it in your hands, you're adding more if necessary. And it's really simple as long as you pay attention and keep records and keep on top of it. And here's just a really quick video. In the foreground, you'll see we've already taken, that pile is the top that we took off. And in the back, you'll see the darker material that's kind of rounded. That's the hot center that we'll be removing next.
Yep.
You can see the different colors, the different moisture contents. Just a really quick shot. How do I?
Yep.
Oh, I went too far. Sorry. All right, so much like the first turn, second turn is the same thing. You're monitoring the temperature, you're following that same protocol. Yeah, we talked about that. All 3 parts are heat treated, killing all the pathogens. And then once you've made that second turn, it's come up to at least 130 degrees for 3 days. Then it's going to start to cool down, or you're going to have to punch some holes to kind of facilitate that cooling down. But once it's come down to ambient temperature, it's ready to use. And like we said at the beginning, that can be in as little as 3 weeks, which is really amazing to create your own fertility in as little as 3 weeks. So some things to check for: smell. You might hear old timers talking about sweet compost or sour compost. Once you start working with this, you really understand what that means. Finished compost smells so sweet. When you do, we'll talk about making extracts and teas out of it. When you make an extract, it's like sweet pastries. The smell is incredible. Also the color, you don't want it to be black. Black is often indicative of anaerobic conditions. You want it to be like a 70–80% cocoa, like dark chocolate color, right? If that makes sense, a brown color. And then ideally, you want to be looking at these things under a microscope. If you're a livestock farmer, you probably have a microscope checking for problems with animals, diseases, and parasites and things. You can apply the same thing to your soil. You want to make sure that you're finding a diverse array of microbiology, of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods. You want to make sure that you're seeing the good guys, the beneficials. You want to make sure that things aren't going anaerobic, that there's no pathogens present. All of this stuff is very abstract when we're talking about it because we can't see it with our own eyes. But when we look under a microscope, it becomes very clear, and it allows us to have a better relationship with our soil and our compost. It's super important when you're growing food. Yep, so this is just a quick 2-minute video. It was filmed on our farm last year, and it just kind of encapsulates everything we just talked about, and you'll be able to see our compost setup and everything.
And we'll turn these twice, get them up to 130 degrees or more, and that one is still coming up. I think it's just above 120 right now, so it'll probably hit 130 tomorrow. And then once it hits that temperature, we let it sit for 3 days or 2 days or 1 day, depending on how hot it got, just to make sure that we've cooked out any pathogens and weed seeds. And then we'll flip it, make sure that we put another part of it into that hot center, and we'll do that twice so that every part of the pile cooks. And then we'll monitor the temperature, turn it if we need to, but just let it come down. And once it's come down, we've got a pile like this, which is something that we would use in the field. And rather than that deep compost application, this is more of an inoculant. So if you smell this, it smells really sweet. There's a lot of biological activity. If you look at it under a microscope, which we do, you can see the bacteria, the protozoa, the fungi, the nematodes, all the good guys.
100 times magnification. This is from Assawaga Farm, a compost pile that's just finished. You see it is really teeming with fungi, various types of fungi, which is really good to see. There's some like fungal spores in the center there, those circles. Let's zoom in on this piece here. And now we're looking at 400 times magnification, and you can see how diverse all of this fungi attached to this aggregate here. So this would make excellent amendment to any soil, especially if you were planting more perennials that need a higher fungal ratio to bacteria. This would do really well.
And we'll turn these.
All right, so that voice you heard is Monique Bosch. We'll give her a shout out. She's a soil scientist. She has a vermicomposting company called Wiggle Room, and she also works with CT NOFA, doing workshops about compost tea. And she was kind of an early driver for us to get into this stuff. She brought over her microscope one day before we took the soil food web class and started really diving down this this compost rabbit hole. So it's been really, really awesome working with her. And so this is just a still shot from that video that we didn't see, but you can see a lot of fungi, a lot of bacteria in the background, lots of diversity, some aggregates. And of course, the star of the show is this beautiful bacterial feeding nematode here. Awesome guy to see in your soil because he's just wriggling around, eating up bacteria, and he's pooping out plant available nitrogen. And I mean, he's doing great work for us and our plants. So one thing with the microscopes, we strive as farmers to really understand our soils. We're obsessed with soil health, and we don't want it to be this abstract thing. We don't want it to be a guessing game as much as it cannot be. So by using a microscope, you can really have a more, we feel like you can really have a more intimate relationship with your soil and make more informed decisions. And yeah, I really recommend learning how to use a microscope and pursuing that.
Okay, so once you have, once your compost is ready, and I guess I want to mention that this is not the kind of compost that you order from commercial composters, and you get this really fine compost that if you wanted to make potting mix or whatever, you can use it in that. It's not like that. What commercial composters do is they, what's the word?
Screen it.
They screen it. So all those, you know, even if there were any, you know, fungal mycelium that was growing through it, through that screening process, it's really just kind of breaking all that apart. And some of those bulkier things do have a lot of microbes on them and good aggregate structure in there too. So our finished product has all of that in there. So although we are sprinkling it into our bed, so, you know, not everything is going to stay intact, but more or less it's not as, you know, intense as screening a compost. So what we do is, and in the soil food web class, they say, you know, a minimum of 11 pounds of compost per 100-foot bed. And that's the minimum, but since it's easier and more practical for us, we just do 2-gallon buckets, 5-gallon buckets. That's a typo there. 2 5-gallon buckets of compost per bed. And we basically, so we have mulch on our bed. So first we rake them off, and then we just walk along the bed and just sprinkle it, just eyeballing, trying to get it on as evenly as possible. These are optional, but we do like to broad fork the bed first. So that means that when you're sprinkling the compost, some of it is going into more of the deeper depths of the soil and inoculating those deeper levels as well. And then finally, we do a light raking on top of the bed so that the compost is kind of well mixed together with our native soil. We do sometimes do applications at the base of plants for, you know, larger fruiting summer vegetables like tomatoes and eggplants. And what we do is we just push the mulch aside and then sprinkle maybe a handful of compost, and then put the mulch back on so it doesn't dry out. And yeah, so that's been working out for us. And then next in the last few slides, we'll talk about teas and extracts, which a small amount of compost will take you really far. So for those of you who might not be too familiar with compost teas and extracts, I just wanted to make a quick distinction between the two. So compost teas are, you take a handful of compost or vermicompost or a mixture of the two, put it in a brewing tank, and you feed it some food. We usually give them something like, we'll go into detail later, but molasses and fish hydrolysate, those are good foods to start with. And we brew it, aerate it for, was it 18 hours or something?
At least 24 hours, but then I'll talk
Okay.
about it.
Yeah. And yeah, what happens there is that because there's so much food, certain species are going to explode in population. So they're really rapidly reproducing. And while they're doing that, they kind of exude some sticky matter. And that's what allows them to stick onto plant surfaces. And that's why compost teas are a really good application for leaves. So just as there's a rhizosphere around the roots of plants where there's a really high activity of microbes, there's such layer around the leaves called phyllosphere. And if you can imagine on the leaves of plants, there's just a bunch of microbes on there, and they're really protecting the plants from, it could be a disease or some kind of pest. So applying tea in this manner is really, like enriching that microbe diversity and population on the surface of leaves. And then on the flip side, there's extracts, which are way easier to make. All you need to do is grab a handful of compost or vermicompost, and we put it in a
mesh bag.
A mesh bag.
Compost tea bag.
Yeah, and then you submerge it into the water, you squish it really hard, and you're basically just knocking off the microbes that are on the surfaces of aggregates. And so you're maintaining the full diversity and range of microbes that are in your compost, but it just means that you need much more compost to make, the same amount of liquid. And these are used as soil drenches because they don't have the ability to really stick onto surfaces. And so, yeah, we do that as part of our bed flipping process too. And then just to give you a reality check, you can't just do a one-time application of an extract or tea and everything's going to be magical and all your problems are gone. You have to do repeated applications to get them to establish in your soil first. And you need to constantly monitor them and apply if necessary. So in the future, you might have less applications, but initially it needs to be a pretty frequent application.
All right, so we'll just talk a little bit more about teas and extracts. When we make tea, we typically make a 5-gallon batch, and we'll probably upgrade at some point to a bigger brewer, maybe a conical shaped brewer. But right now we're just using a 5-gallon bucket, and I think it's called a Bubble Snake. You can find it online. It's basically a company that just takes a PVC pipe and forms it to fit perfectly inside a 5-gallon bucket. And that's been working really well for us. It just has a small pump for the size we are and the applications we're doing. To make a 5-gallon batch, we'll typically use 1 pound of compost. And for the tea, we usually use vermicompost for it. It's going on leaves. There's not manure going into the worm bin, so there's not that potential for pathogens. And then the worms, through their digestive system, are kind of purifying the microorganisms that are in there. They're selecting for good beneficial bacteria and fungi. So we just feel better about using that as a leaf application, especially if it's getting closer to harvest time. So like Yoko said, the difference between tea and extracts, one of the major differences is that you're adding food to teas because you're trying to take a little bit of biology and multiply it massively. We add a little bit of kelp meal, some molasses, some fish meal, humates. Again, good to have a diversity of inputs. Something like molasses is going to be food for bacteria primarily. They're going to explode. Something like humates is going to be more for the fungal growth. So you really want a good balance in the food that you're putting in. We brew it for a minimum of 24 hours. And earlier we spoke about how you can kind of fine tune compost applications. And this is one example where you can really fine tune it very quickly just by waiting a little bit longer. It's really cool because if you look at it after 24 hours, what we always find is that it's primarily bacteria. Bacteria has exploded, it's consuming all that sugary molasses, just going nuts. And you'll find that there's a lot of diverse bacteria, but it's mostly bacteria. And then you might see a few protozoa swimming around. You might see some flagellates, some amoeba. Let it brew for another 6 hours and come back. And we found that all of a sudden there's not as much bacteria, but there's tons of flagellates swimming around. So you've got this predator-prey cycle that kind of works like a sinusoidal wave, right? You've got the prey takes off, and then the predators catch up to it, and then they overeat the prey, and then their numbers come down. So by waiting a little bit longer, you can really fine tune what you're putting down. If you go out, you take a sample, you find it's heavy in bacteria, but there's not a lot of protozoa, you can actually select for the protozoa and do that application. And those protozoa are gonna eat the bacteria and release that plant available nutrients. So it's really cool to see that under the microscope. We apply the tea to the leaves using a backpack sprayer. We'll make it in a 5-gallon bucket, so you get about 4 gallons of finished tea. We'll do a gallon at a time, and then we'll dilute it to the full 4 gallon in the backpack sprayer. And we'll just use a mist nozzle on it. You want to make sure that it's not too small, the mist that's coming out, because that can actually damage the microorganisms that are coming through. You want to be able to deliver them effectively. One backpack will do about 4 to 6 of our 100-foot beds, and that's walking down and back, you want to get leaf coverage top and bottom of the leaves as much as possible. Like Yoko said, that's going to make a protective barrier on the leaf. If you get about 70% coverage, then say a disease-causing fungal spore lands on the surface, they're not going to have a place to attach and infect the leaf. So if you can keep that phyllosphere really rugged, it's going to protect the plants. And like I said, we usually use vermicompost for that, for the reasons that I outlined. The extract is a bit different. We still make it in 5-gallon buckets. Requires a bit more compost. Instead of 1 pound for a 5-gallon batch, we use 1 pound for a 2-gallon batch. And that's because we're not increasing the number, we're not feeding the microbiology. So we're really just stripping off what's already present on the compost. So we'll put that 1 pound in a mesh bag, and then we'll put it in the water. And what you really have to focus on, you're not necessarily like crushing up the compost, you're using your hands to pump the water rapidly over the surface of the compost, and you just keep rotating that bag and moving it. And the idea is that you're stripping all of that, the microbiology off of the aggregates in the compost and suspending them in the solution. And then we'll put that into a watering can. We'll put a gallon in and then fill it with a gallon of water, and we'll apply that to the field. You can also add fish to it as a biostimulant and as a little bit of extra fertilizer for the plants. And for this, because it's a soil drench, it's not going directly on the leaves, we use mostly the finished thermophilic compost, and we'll add a little bit of vermicompost too for the diversity. So maybe 3/4 of a pound of the thermophilic and then a 1/4 pound of vermicompost. And that just gives us a really wide array of microbiology. And then nothing gets wasted. So that compost, once we finish the process, take it out of the bag, clean up all the equipment, we can let it dry out a little bit because it's pretty saturated, and that can go right on a bed or around plants. It can go back into the compost pile to be re-inoculated. Nothing goes to waste with the composting. So that's an overview of our composting. And I think that the things that we really want to drive home to you guys is like diversity is key. It's the spice of life. And and you can do this. We're doing it at a very small scale, and it feels really fulfilling to close loops on our farm, not just have a big pile of veggie waste that we don't know what to do with, and you have to wait years to use. It's really been a great experience for us, and we're super excited about it.
Yeah, once you kind of integrate it into your farm practice. So what we do is gather all the materials on Mondays, soak it overnight, and then Tuesday we build the piles. And so just getting into that rhythm is not super hard to do.
And flipping a pile by hand, honestly, it takes us 20 minutes tops.
Yeah.
So a lot of folks,
With two
people, yeah.
With one, you've done it by yourself.
yeah, it's maybe
number of
30,
times, and
40 minutes.
you can do it by yourself too.
A lot of people think you need a tractor to do it, even on this scale. If you're doing bigger windrows and things like that, you know, a tractor is crucial. But you have to also be a good operator and be able to finesse it because of, you know, getting things heat treated effectively, making sure that everything goes through that process. But doing this on a small scale, even if you're doing a static pile where you're building up a bulk content and then you're making this compost, which is more of an inoculant, you can then take that inoculant and inoculate the bulk pile later. So this is it's a very effective way of doing it that has worked out well for us.
Hey, this is so great, guys. I love soil. I think it's an amazing, wonderful thing. So I'm glad that we've gotten to talk about it. I am real quick going to drop the link to the survey one more time in the chat. We're going to move on to question and answer time. But I just ask that, you know, if you enjoyed this, please fill out that survey. We give feedback to Yoko and Alex so that they can be even better presenters next time, and so that we can give an even better workshop next time. So it's really invaluable to us, as well as reporting to our funders so that we can keep doing more workshops. But I have been collecting questions that have been forming in the chat so far. So I'm going to start off with those. But if you have more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We definitely want to hear from people and hear what Alex and Yoko have to say. So one of the first things that somebody, Heather, brought up in the chat was using anything from quote unquote aquatic death. So I know you mentioned some crushed sea kelp in one of your slides, but do you use anything else in composting, like from the sea? Because as we know, there are a lot of benefits from the sea, and some of us are closer to the coastal areas in Connecticut.
We haven't, except for the kelp meal that we get. Certainly, if you should use what's local to you and what's accessible. I went to school up in Maine, and a lot of farms in the fall would go to the coastline and collect seaweed and use that on their fields. So if it's available to you, it's not that close for us. I mean, we're in Eastern Connecticut, but still. I know that Brian O'Hara collects seawater sometimes. He uses that for a mineral aspect to his compost. So I would say if you're close, certainly try to factor it in. The only thing that we worry about sometimes with that, and I forget where we heard this, but somebody had given this anecdote once where they got a bunch of seaweed.
And I heard you wash. Did you need a wipe or anything?
You gotta mute.
Please mute.
We got it.
So somebody got a whole bunch of seaweed, a farmer, put it on his field. The seaweed broke down, and what was left behind was a ton of plastic.
Well, they
so
say, now say the soil has more microplastic than the ocean.
There's that
so
too.
I mean, if you use row cover, you're gonna have, you know, like anything we do, it's just gonna have microplastic.
It is. It's true. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's. I mean, that was just something that we heard from somebody's experience. But honestly, one of the reasons that we started on this was because the waste stream is so incredibly messed up in this country, and we would get compost from, you know, a big commercial composter, and there was just tons of trash in it. And you know, they would get their stuff from landscapers, and they would just be sucking up children's toys and all sorts of stuff, and it was pretty unacceptable. So that was one of the big drivers for this, is to escape that.
Yeah, I can't recall how many times I've gone into the field and found like a really beat up candy wrapper that I know came in with the compost, just because they fly everywhere.
Yeah.
So Jennifer was wondering, you mentioned making for the teas and the extracts using water. Is there any special water that you use? Do you have your own well and that's why you're okay using that water? If someone doesn't have a well, what do they use, et cetera, et cetera? Does it matter?
Do you want to talk about it? Or
I
can
don't know
start
if I'm
again.
gonna describe it.
So we do have our own well. We don't have to worry about chlorinated water. But if you do have chlorinated water, you do need to account for that. So one thing, the easiest thing to do is just to put it into a bucket and then leave it. If you leave it, I don't know what the period of time is, but
Sure, you can Google it.
yeah, they talked about it in that course we took. But the other thing you can do is add humic acid to it,
Right.
and that will neutralize it pretty immediately. But that is a concern. You know, it's good to take a water test, a water quality test, find out what's in your water. We have a very deep well that's right here on the property, and it's excellent water. So we don't have to think about that. But I definitely feel for people that do. That's something that you have to think about. That was a good question for sure.
So Robert was wondering if there are specific teas, crops that you spray with your teas, or specific crops that you spray your extracts on. Are those specific to different types of crops, or are they kind of a panacea where they go for everybody?
Honestly, you know, given the work that goes into it, we're not going to apply it on Asian greens that are going to be ready to harvest in 3 weeks. You know, something that's more long-term, it's going to have benefits later on in the season. Definitely more higher value crops we apply it to. Yeah, is there anything else to say about that?
That's for, yeah, speaking for the tea, the tea.
Yeah, the extract we put
the extract
down,
you can put anywhere.
yeah, we kind of put it down as kind of our bed flip anyway.
Yeah.
So all the beds get it. But for the tea, it's a little more selective.
And then Kat mentioned or asked, are you composting in winter? Because you guys aren't necessarily growing anything right now. So yes,
Yeah.
that, but also to follow up with that, Lauren was wondering what times of year do you do different stages of your composting process? So, I mean, obviously this is a quick turnaround compost that you guys are doing, but like, how does that change during the seasons for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's something that we think about all the time, because when you think about greens material, so veggie scraps, you just don't have enough coming out of the garden until late May, which means you're not going to have compost till, you know, doing it the way we explained until early July at the earliest. So tying in that period of time in the spring is definitely something that we're kind of always trying to think about. And I think right now we're going to explore, so a lot of veggie scraps come out in the fall. And obviously by that time it's too cold, we're too tired to be making compost. So then it goes into the bulk pile. So our kind of ideal situation would be to use that bulk pile as sort of a slight, you know, partially decomposed material, not completely brown, but not green either. So using that and then using a higher ratio of high nitrogen components such as manure and potentially blood meal if we need to, that kind of thing. But yeah, in the course they well, actually I don't know if it was on course, maybe it was in a forum, but they do talk about compost that's made in the fall, and if you want to maintain the level of microbes in the compost, it's really tricky. You have to obviously have it warm enough during the winter and also feed it foods during the winter. So it's best for the compost that you make that year, you should just apply it to your soil, even if you're done with your crops and everything. That will do just as good at that time of the year as it is in the summer. But yeah, that's a really tricky question and something that we're still addressing. And we did get 21 buckets of manure from Bottle Farm yesterday, so we have enough like nitrogen sources
Stocking
to.
up.
But definitely the temperature, ambient temperature, really makes it, you know, hard to bring the temperature up if it's really cold.
Yeah.
So
We've thought about maybe starting early in the spring in the greenhouse with a pile or two, but then we only have one greenhouse and the propagation space is so precious at that time of year that I don't think we'll pursue that necessarily. But another thing is with vermicomposting, you can do it year round. We have them indoors in our utility room. It's about 60 degrees all the time, and we just constantly feed them. So they're stocking up too. And so we could brew teas early in the spring, and the first things that we transplant can start to get those inoculations. So that's another option too.
Real quick follow-up question. Does the chicken manure have bedding with it, or is Nick like really, really good to you and screens out everything so it's just poop?
It has bedding, but
Yeah.
I think they use hemp bedding now.
Okay, cool.
So this is why it's important to know where your things are coming from. I don't know if we would get manure from anyone else, honestly. We've been friends with them for a long time, but their practices are top notch. You know, they're using non-soy, non-corn, non-GMO, organic feed. Really, just like we are with our soil, they're hyper focused on their inputs, and so we feel good about that. If we didn't have that direct relationship and we weren't sure, then we'd be much more hesitant to use it.
and also, yeah, so that's a good point, because there is bedding in it. It's not as high nitrogen as I explained earlier in the slides. So where it would be 1 bucket per 10 bucket pile, you might need 2 buckets or something.
Or we might supplement it with clover.
Yeah, so you really, once you have your local kind of sources, ingredients for your compost, you really have to tweak it to get the right levels of each ingredient. And that's part of the fun.
So Andrew was wondering about pretty much, are there things that you wouldn't put in your compost pile because maybe they have too much disease or they're too infested with pests? I mean, I know that would never happen to you guys. You would never have that much disease and pests because you're yeah, you never have those problems. But are there things that you're like, I'm not sure if this should go in the pile?
Nope. We don't have to, I mean, as long as you're following those temperature rules, you're making sure that you are ridding those pathogens and whatever pest disease there might be. So you really don't have to worry about it. And that's the great thing about this method. Whereas, you know, another kind of, you know, with commercial compost, you never know if they really are monitoring their temperatures in all areas of the compost. So yeah, they might not be killing all their pathogens, but with this method, we're fairly confident. So.
Well, you can tell when you get weed seeds in a commercial compost load, right? They go through the heat treating process. Or if you ever get compost that shows up and it's still hot, it's not compost. Like it hasn't finished. So it can still harbor pathogens and weed seeds and things like that. But that heat treatment will kill all the bad guys.
So we have time for just maybe 1 or 2 more questions, but before we dive into those, I mean, we're just not going to get into all the questions. So Yoko and Alex, are you willing for people to contact you after the fact if they have other questions?
Sure.
Great. So we will be happy to share their contact information, and also people were wondering if they would be able to have access to your wonderful slides, which I can send them. just so you all know, public service announcement. So Lauren just wanted to clarify something. She asked, you apply your finished compost as a 30-inch deep bed on top of rake untilled soil? Question mark. Lauren, if you're here, oh yeah, there you are. Go ahead and see if you want to clarify that.
Hi, sorry. I just wanted to make sure that I understood how you apply your compost to your garden beds. If you could just, it looked like in the picture it was on top of like a raked soil, and then you built it up to about 30 inches. I just want to make sure that I have a clear picture.
Yeah, of course. So we just carry one 5-gallon bucket full of compost in one arm, and just take the other hand and sprinkle it onto the bed, and that's really all we do. We do broad fork before we do that, just so that we, it creates these channels where the compost can fall through to deeper levels. But yeah, and then we lightly rake it afterwards. So
yeah, the raked part that you see in that video, all of our beds besides direct seeded quick crops are mulched. We have salt marsh hay down, so we have to rake the salt marsh hay off, and that exposes our bed underneath, and then we'll broad fork, put down the compost, and then just very, very lightly just kind of rake the top like 1/4 inch of it. We're really trying not to disturb the soil at all, and our beds are 30 inches wide, 100 feet long. So hopefully that clarifies.
It did, thank you. This was super informative.
So last question that we'll throw out there, if that's okay. There were a couple questions about what happens if you don't use all your compost up by the end of the season and you have this leftover compost that is sitting around through the winter.
We've got a little bit out there right now.
Yeah, what are you gonna do with it?
You can put that as your Browns material in the first, or the piles that you do in the spring or early summer.
But the biology in it, it's going to go dormant when conditions are not favorable. So if it dries out too much or if it gets too cold, they'll just revert to a dormant stage. So it'd be interesting to look at those piles. We have 2 out there right now that we didn't get to spread, and we'll look at them under a microscope in the spring and see what biology comes back. And they might not need to go through another process, but like Yoko said, it doesn't go to waste. It'll just go into another pile if it needs to be heat treated again.
Yeah. And Becca, we can do like a really quick, just like answering of some of these questions that are left here.
Go for it. Do a lightning round.
Okay. So
Knock it
Lauren,
out of the park.
can Alex and Yoko speak to the difference in biology between their system and the Johnson-Su bioreactor system? So the Johnson-Su bioreactor is something that you leave for at least a year. It's really to build up a really fungal, rich compost. So, and normally the way that Mr. Johnson shows it in videos is he really just uses leaves. So there's not a ton of diversity in the inputs, but you could, increase the diversity, definitely. But you get a very fungally end product there.
If you saw in an earlier slide, we showed a picture of one of our buckets with the aged wood chips, and there were these really thick mycelial hyphae hanging off of it.
Oh, yeah.
So we use it kind of accomplishes a similar thing in a shorter time span, because we have a big pile of aged wood chips that have been aged for a few years, and they're completely just inoculated with fungal hyphae. So we use that as an input, and then we have a lot of fungal growth in our piles too.
Yeah, Peter asks, all in, how many hours of labor do you think it takes one person to make a yard of compost?
The piles that we make are probably between 1 and 2 yards, and it's building the pile is gathering the materials. The initial building of the pile is what?
Well, with
hour
3
and a
people, like
half.
an hour or so.
And then the 2 subsequent flips are about 20 minutes each. So you're at
The
about,
initial pile building takes a little longer, so that's more like 40 minutes maybe.
okay.
So maybe 2 hours.
2 to
with
2.5
people.
hours with 3 people. So one person, I don't know, maybe 5 hours. I don't know. It depends how fast you can do it.
Yeah,
how
it depends.
strong
I
you
mean,
are.
if you have like a tractor that can put all your wood chips in into like 8 buckets at a time or something like that. I don't know. There could be, I guess, easier ways to do some things.
Yeah, but it's totally worth it. And it's not like a solid block of time. You're doing it over the course of several days. So it's really manageable.
Yeah. And somebody asked, Sarah McDonald asked, you mentioned you were not worried about phosphorus at the beginning of the talk. Can you clarify what you meant by that? I said I was I am worried about phosphorus because they tend to inhibit mycorrhizal fungi, and high levels of one nutrient usually tends to tie up other nutrients. So you don't really want an excess of nutrient is way harder to address than a limiting nutrient. Our chicken bedding consists of sand, diatomaceous earth. Would that negatively impact compost production?
I
don't think.
I mean, the
So, but
diatomaceous earth,
the microarthropods and stuff.
I don't know if it would, well, it would affect macroarthropods, but I don't know if, I'm not sure about that one. We don't like, so I think it's more of like what your soil is like too. So we have fine sandy loam. We don't want to add any more sand to our soil. So if you have fine sandy loam, it's probably not an amendment that you want to add. But other than that, I'm not sure. The sand is probably okay, but the diatomaceous earth is a question mark.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it breaks down more in the compost. I'm not sure. Yeah. But do you use any sort of IMO inoculate for your compost? We don't, but because we do forage for, perennial, like leaves off of perennial plants, and maybe we might grab some, forest floor, like leaves or litter and stuff like that. That basically is inoculating the compost with, some of our native biology.
Is that everything?
I think that was like one.
Well, if we missed something or if you have more questions, feel free to email us.
Yeah, do you raise bees? No, we don't.
But yeah, the tea.
Yeah,
the tea shouldn't have any effect on bees. I mean, it should be a beneficial thing for them. There's just a very quick thing. If you know who Paul Stamets is, he's a world famous mycologist, and he swears he has the way to stop colony collapse disorder, and it's because fungi are like nature's immune system. Basically, they're breaking down all these complex things and making them available. And he's witnessed bees feeding on the dew that garden giants, wine cap mushrooms, King Stropharia put out in the morning, and he, through his research, believes that is actually curing or can cure colony collapse disorder. So.
Wow.
It's beneficial.
That's awesome.
Do you grow any crops specifically to enrich your compost? Asks Patty. We don't.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you guys so much for presenting. This was amazing. I feel like we all learned a ton of information, and it was just wonderful to have it be I mean, I know it's complicated and pretty intense, but I love the fact that a lot of us can start and have usable compost in a short amount of time. And, you really put a lot of us like right in, a good place to give us some inspiration to start. So thank you again for that. Again, for all of you that are like clicking and signing off, please, just as a reminder, please do your evaluations because they really help us. And just thank you for being here tonight, all of you guys. And Becca, for your services. Everything went swimmingly well. And I really, really appreciate everybody's help putting this program together, and especially Yoko and Alex. It was really awesome. Thank you for presenting for us.